Okay, so thanks everybody for joining for this is our 2025 fourth quarter animal disaster training for the emergency management folks in Colorado. But of course, this is welcome to everybody, not just in Colorado or in Extension. This is open to all of our partnering agencies, community members, and of course anyone else that just would like to watch this video. This will be recorded and available on the CSU Extension YouTube channels. We'll make sure that that link is public, so you're welcome to watch this. And then, of course, if you have questions later on past this recording, I'm sure Dr. Kathy will supply her contact information for you to reach out to her directly if you have further questions. With that in mind, with questions, if you guys all have questions during it, feel free to type them into the chat, and Dr. Whitman and I will kind of monitor that, and she will answer them as we go, and then she'll also have time at the end. But otherwise, we'll just kind of keep it rolling here. So with that, thanks so much, and so I'll hand it over to Dr. Kathy Whitman. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth, for having me. Again, my name is Dr. Kathy Whitman. I'm the CSU Veterinary Extension Specialist. So I work with Extension around the state of Colorado in all sorts of animal health issues. I'm the primary contact at CSU for Extension anytime there's any sort of animal health issue, questions, those types of things. So I do a lot with emergency management at CSU and work with Beth quite a bit on how we plan, prepare, and address emergencies as they come up. And so as a veterinarian, my primary focus, of course, is going to be animal health and disease. And so with this presentation today, that's really what we're going to be focused on. I'm not going to focus too much on how we set up, emergency management systems or the logistics of those issues, but really what I want to focus on today is how Extension plays a role in animal health during these times of disaster. Again, here's our statement on equal opportunity, access, and non-discrimination. If anybody has any issues or concerns with the presentation that I'm making today, please feel free to contact me and we can get those issues cleared up. So today what we're going to talk about is some different categories of animal disease when it comes into emergency management and disaster. So the first thing we'll talk about is animal disease as the emergency itself and how Extension plays a role in those situations. We'll also discuss when we have an emergency, when we have a natural disaster, what sort of diseases might we expect to see during that disaster, and then what animal health concerns we may have after the disaster. And then we'll go through some mitigation strategies and resources to help people plan for these types of issues. So really what I want to target today as far as what you guys take away from this presentation. So I want you to understand how animal health is impacted by disaster. So understanding what sort of issues may arise, things that maybe you hadn't thought about. As we go through this session, try to think about when we bring up a topic, what are you good at? What do you recognize that maybe you can really play a role if something comes up? And then also maybe what you're short on and things that you need to work on to address these animal health issues as they come about. So I think really thinking about, I'm good at this, I'm not so good at this, what can I focus my attention on to improve my overall response, my overall contribution to these issues. I want you to feel more comfortable with animal health advice. As Extension and as other people involved in animal agriculture, you're certainly going to be asked these questions. There's not always a veterinarian available. There's not always good resources available. And so you may be the front lines. And so having some understanding would be is something I want you to come away with as we go through this session. And then I'm going to give you a lot of resources as we go through here that you can kind of go hang on to and access when you get into these disasters. All right, so first let's talk about the disease as the actual outbreak emergency. So we've had lots of examples of these, and we'll go through case examples as we go through each one of these topics. But what is the role of Extension in an animal disease outbreak? And so when we get into these situations, questions come up about who reports it, who handles the disease outbreak, and where do you get that information as these disease outbreaks are going on. How can you help your constituents when they have these questions? And so extension really might be the first person to know. So if something happens, somebody may report it to you. You may be the first line of defense when somebody has a question. This is going on in my herd. What should I do about it? And as we talk about these disease outbreaks that happen, hopefully you have some understanding of the disease issues that are going on, and you can recognize that this is an issue. And so then you can be the liaison between that producer and the state veterinarian or their local veterinarian or even myself. Remember that in each one of these situations, this can be a pretty sensitive situation. So when we have, especially when we have foreign animal disease outbreaks, sometimes people don't want to report this because that means that they're going to get the government is going to be on their place, and so you have to be really sensitive to that. But realize that not only are you worried about the client that you're dealing with, but you're also trying to protect those around that producer. And so we need to make sure that we do go ahead and report these things, and we encourage producers to report. You can get in contact with me or their veterinarian, and as veterinarians, we do have an obligation to report things that are concerning. So you can sort of remove that liability from yourself if that's a concern. As disease outbreaks occur, one of your roles is going to be getting those people reliable, getting producers, getting stakeholders reliable information on what's going on. And so hopefully you have some resources at hand that can give you up to date and correct information. I think that there's CDA is a good example. They have a nice Facebook page that has information on it that kind of keeps you up to date on the latest disease outbreaks. Lots of information on websites, but there's also a lot of feedback and information from people that are following those pages that can be a little bit incorrect. And so we saw that in the recent EHV1 outbreak, a lot of misinformation that happens, and so can really flare up a situation. So making sure that the information that you're relaying is correct is really, really important. Training, we talked a lot about training in our meeting just recently. Lots of opportunities to understand the disease that you're dealing with, and then understanding if people in your area need help identifying disease or how to control disease, biosecurity, what sort of issues do you recognize in your community that might be helpful, that you can help with to get the disease under control and to protect other producers. We all have the ability to become an ESF11. You might have that function. We have an MOU with the Colorado Department of Ag now in Extension. And so if there's an opportunity for you to get that training, that might be an opportunity where you can actually play a bigger role, not only in animal disease outbreaks, but in other disaster situations. So overall, in animal disease outbreak situations, just remember that you are not a diagnostician. You do not have to, call the disease, and tell somebody that, yes, this is what you have. That's not your role. And so don't feel like you have to give a definitive answer. You just need to relay information to people that have that ability. So the state veterinarian, or the local veterinarian, letting them know what's going on is really important. And so that's really your role, is to be a support, to have a support function for the larger veterinary group at hand if we have a disease outbreak. And so really surveillance and reporting is going to be your role, and supporting your producers and educating those in the area, in your communities that might be fearful or have a lot of questions about what might be going on. Some local resources here. The Department of Ag has a lot of good resources. If you go to their animal health site on their website, and then their Facebook page can have some updated information. When we had the high path outbreak, they had situation reports on their website, so you kind of keep track of what was going on with that outbreak, and where the disease was going, and not necessarily who was affected, but what areas were affected. If people have questions about the security of their information when they report to the government, Colorado has a very strict law in place that protects people's identity and their location if in a disease outbreak. And so really reassuring these producers that if they report a disease, they're not going to be, their name isn't going to be blasted all over the news. That information isn't going to go anywhere. And the Department of Ag really stands behind that and doesn't share that information, which actually can be sort of difficult if you're trying to do some surveillance and trying to let people know, this is how close the disease is. People are really, really protected. And so just reassure your stakeholders that their information isn't going to be out in the public press. They're going to be protected. The idea is to get that disease under control and protect everyone around them, but not to share their information in such a way that they'll be harmed. APHIS always has up-to-date information. I shouldn't say always, depending on if the government is open or not. They have up-to-date information on disease processes that are not only going on locally, but also around our country. So New World Screwworm is an example of that. As it moves, what information is the most useful will be on that website as well. So let's go through a couple case examples here. So New World Screwworm, let's say that it arrives here in the United States. So this is a current map of what's going on, and that arrow there represents fictional, at this point in time, a fictional transmission of that bug into Texas. And so what happens when it comes into this country? What is Extension's role? And so really, our role in a New World Screwworm outbreak in the United States as Extension is surveillance. Okay, so people are going to come to us, and they probably already have, and said, what do I do? What should I be worried about? And so your role is going to be giving them information, giving them the up-to-date stats for where the bug is, and then if they have questions, if they come to you and if they have specimens, Extension will have a role in submitting those specimens to the state veterinarian or to the National Diagnostic Lab. So really, Extension is going to be on the ground, the boots on the ground, to get that information back to the veterinarians, the state veterinarians, the USDA veterinarians for surveillance. So Extension will have a pretty extensive role if we happen to see this in the United States. There's been trainings for Extension going on in Texas and New Mexico and other states. Colorado will be planning that here coming up in a week to see what that's going to look like and how Extension is really going to play a role. In the meantime, the resources that I have listed here will have the most up-to-date information. So the screwworm.org is a news site that has all of those resources on there, including the playbook, which has a role for Extension, surveillance, monitoring, that sort of stuff is all in that playbook. And so if you're interested, especially if you're in the southern part of the state, you can go ahead and review that and see kind of where might I fit in if something like this were to happen. What should I do if one of my stakeholders comes to me and says, you know what, I found these maggots. Are they screwworm? And you know where to send that off to and how to do that. So all those will be things that Extension will do. Hopefully we never have to do this, but it is good to be prepared because it has traveled further north, and so we need to keep an eye out for that. Another case example that we've just gone through recently, still in the middle of, are cases of equine herpes virus. And so when it becomes a neurologic form, this is where we get really concerned. So equine herpes virus is not an uncommon virus in the United States, but when it takes this form, when horses go down, when they become neurologic, that represents a major concern, and these horses can die. And so what do we do? What's our role in this sort of situation? And we kind of saw this play out in the past month or so. So really the biggest thing is being a reliable source of information for your stakeholders. Like I said, there's been a lot of information on certain websites, on Facebook, that might not be accurate. And so making sure that you can keep people calm, keep them from continuing to perpetuate misinformation is really, really important to keep people level-headed in dealing with this disease appropriately. The Equine Disease Control Center is a really good site for any equine disease, but certainly they've done a good job keeping people up to date on the equine herpes virus outbreak situation. And so that's something that certainly you can access. Anybody can access that website to figure out what important equine diseases are going on. And so as this disease continues to, as we continue to monitor it and surveil the horses that were at the site of origin, this website is going to be really important to keep the best and most accurate information. AAEP.org is a good resource for just information on diseases. So this is a veterinary organization that really has a lot of guidelines. They have good resources that you can distribute out to stakeholders if they want more information for groups on certain equine diseases, and particularly the equine herpes virus. When you have in any sort of disease outbreak situation, when people are concerned and they're worried about, is my horse at risk? Understanding how the disease works is really important, and so then you can ask the right questions. Some of these horses, some people were concerned in this situation that their horse might be at risk, but really they had no exposure to the disease. And so there's not a whole lot of need to get stressed over a situation that really has nothing to do with that equine facility. And so really doing these trace backs was really important, because this is a contagious disease. And so, if you knew of people that had gone to competitive barrel races during this time, then those would be somebody that you would address. Whereas other folks, backyard horse owners that are concerned about it, you can kind of put their mind at ease and say, as long as you don't have exposure to these situations, then you'll be okay. And so I think understanding how the disease works is really important for you to relay useful information to clients. And then as we go forward planning events, this site here is from CSU Extension. It's a good site for equine biosecurity practices. And so this would be an example of a resource that you could put out to clients, to stakeholders in this sort of situation. Any questions so far? Beth, do you see anything in the chat?
There's nothing in the chat.
Okay. All right, so if there's no questions right now, we'll go ahead and move on to the next section of disease issues, and those would be health issues that we see during disaster. So not a disease outbreak per se, but something if we have a certain natural disaster that goes on, fire, flood, those sorts of issues, what sort of diseases might we see and how do we manage that? So in this section here, we're not going to talk specifically about what role you'll play in the disaster itself, but really how you can recognize animal disease issues and how maybe we can mitigate those. So when we have some sort of natural disaster that goes on, you might be the first line of contact once again as Extension to say what issues am I concerned about with my animals. If we have an evacuation situation, how can Extension play a role and make sure that animal health is managed well? So knowing your local emergency manager is a good idea, so they have somebody to contact when they're setting up these sorts of evacuation situations, or we're staying in place on a facility, but how can we keep those animals healthy? And so having that good relationship there will keep you on the front lines and make sure that animal health and welfare needs are met. This site here from the Colorado Department of Ag is the emergency management site. I encourage you all to visit this site, review some of the materials that are there. There's some information there from CSU. There's cart access, cart resources are on this site where you can identify some of those places. If you're in a county that doesn't have a cart, where can you go for those resources? All kinds of information on there for you. I'd encourage you to go to this site beforehand, before you have an emergency, to kind of understand what's available there for you as a resource when something like this hits. So what's our role when we have a disaster, and how do we keep animal health intact? And so again, you're going to be the first person that knows some of these issues that are going on. People will report to you that they may have to evacuate, or they have animals that are sick or injured. And so understanding your resources is going to be really important at this time. Again, these are going to be sensitive situations from both from a legal concern, but also you're going to have clients that are going to have mental health components to this. Their animals are sick or dying. They can't get to their animals, things like that. And we've all seen situations where that's gone pretty poorly. And so as Extension, we have access to mental health care providers through Agribility that certainly are equipped to help you deal with some of these issues. And so don't be afraid to reach out to those folks. Again, reaching out to your human resources, and human resources, I don't mean your HR department, but really who in Extension knows how to deal with some of these situations. And so if you're in a situation where you're not sure, there's plenty of human resources in Extension that you can reach out to and say, what can I do here? What would be the smartest thing to go through? I think don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us in Extension that's been in some of these situations or that understands animal health. They certainly can help you out. As you go through the disaster, again, outreach and education are going to be your primary role, making sure that people are kept up to date, making sure that the message that you send out to people when they're asking you questions is consistent with the public information officer when you're making statements about what's going on with animal health. I think it's really important to have the same consistent message. And if you're not sure, then just pass that on to somebody that in a the public information officer role to answer those questions if that's available. I think it's really important to not make any statements that will put us in a corner at some point. So just keep that in mind as people are asking you questions or putting blame on someone or something like that. Just keep that in mind that we need to be sure that we're careful about what we say and what we do and just make sure that we're getting out good information. Remember that when these disasters take place, that you might be the subject matter expert, whether you're comfortable with it or not, in terms of animal health. And so having some training and some preparation of that is a good idea. Beth had mentioned in our meeting before that there's an all hazards playbook that was created by an extension intern this past summer. And so that's going to be coming out here pretty shortly. And so this is a book that's made for first responders and really deals with animal health specifically, but it's a nice summary that any one of you can access and utilize when you're dealing with animal health issues during disasters. And so that's a really good resource that I would encourage you once it comes out to review, go through. Really good playbook for helping you get through some of these animal health issues that you might not be totally comfortable with. This is some examples from that all hazards animal health considerations playbook here. So some immediate concerns. So when we're in the middle of a disaster, what are we worried about? So in general, stress is a really big issue for animals, and any stress that animals feel can cause injury and immune system suppression. And so we're going to have disease outbreaks just from that stress. And so that's really important to remember to minimize stress when we're dealing with these animals, and not that you're going to be dealing with the animals specifically, but when you're consulting with first responders, when you're consulting with owners, just using calm handling techniques, making sure that we minimize stress as much as possible. When people are asking you about evacuation situations and you're thinking about how do we minimize animal health issues, think about things that will spread. And so we want to minimize contact between animals that are not from the same place, right? That makes sense. And so one of the things that you will see, maybe not immediately, but at some point in the near future, if we have animals all brought together, it's just like bringing all the little kids together in kindergarten. We're probably going to have some sort of disease outbreak, and usually it's respiratory related. So those are disease issues that you can think about as we're putting together these evacuation situations. How are you going to guide biosecurity? This is going to be your role here, to remind people about biosecurity and keeping those animals separate that aren't used to each other, that don't know each other, that haven't had that contact. Really can be your role to minimize the post disaster disease outbreaks that we might see. And then feed and water availability. Sometimes people will forget about this in the midst of all the stress. And so as extension, you understand the need, the immediate need for feed and water access for these livestock and these animals. And so that could be one of your roles, is reminding people that, this is critically important. And so let's think about this as we're putting together our strategy. More specifically, in things like fire and hazardous waste, flood, heat, and cold, there's some specific issues that you'll want to keep in mind as extension when people are talking to you about, what do I need to be concerned with in terms of my animals as we're either sheltering in place or as we're evacuating. All of these issues with fire and hazardous waste. Smoke exposure is a big one. Burns if the animals were actually involved in the fire, and chemical exposure. With floods, we think about contamination of food and water, but any sort of area that gets contaminated with these flood waters can be a concern. And then, of course, there's going to be when you wash all of the surfaces with flood water, then we have this mixture of nastiness that has additional parasites and bacteria and viruses, and so really some disease can pop up in those areas. So making people aware that those could be some issues that pop up and that we need to address immediately can be a concern. When we talk about heat and cold, just mitigating those issues that pop up with those sorts of disasters. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically about those here in just a second. When we get into evacuation situations or even shelter in place situations, we're not going to be the veterinarian on staff, but really making sure that people understand if somebody else, first responders or somebody else is involved in monitoring these animals for the time being a resource for these folks and helping them understand, what sort of disease issues to look at as we're monitoring these animals is going to be our role. And so again, stressing biosecurity, making sure that if you assist on a place that people are following those biosecurity strategies, making sure that, as we're going in and out of stalls or in and out, we're touching animals to minimize the contact between animals, proper PPE, those sorts of things. This is all common sense stuff, but sometimes in the middle of a disaster and in the middle of all this stress, people forget that. And as extension, you can sort of be the calming force that says, let's keep our wits about us and let's follow our biosecurity protocols to make sure that post-disaster we have more success. We're going to want to keep an eye on, because of feed issues that arise. We're going to be giving feed to these animals that maybe they're not familiar with. We might see things like colic and bloat, and so those GI upset issues we need to be monitoring and consulting with these folks on, making sure that we don't give a horse that's never seen grain before, a bucket of grain because they're not familiar with it. So these are all common sense things as extension and as people that are familiar with animals that others might not be. So always reminding people gently that just need to be aware and be cautious of what they're doing. When we see trauma in these animals, whether that was in the disaster or in transit, recognizing that trauma, referring that animal to some veterinary care, and then understanding if an animal is suffering and we need to go ahead and euthanize those animals. That might be something that you'll have to deal with or you'll be consulted on from other folks. Does this animal look like they're suffering? And obviously you can contact a veterinarian if you're not comfortable with that call, but in some situations that might not be available. So probably something that you should consider, especially in a severe disaster situation. So let's go through a couple of case examples here. So the first example here is a snowstorm in eastern Colorado. We had a little bit of snow this past week, nothing that I would say goes to the level of an emergency, but certainly something that we've seen before. And so if this situation hits us, what are the things that we're most concerned about for producers that are on the eastern plains that get a lot of snow dumped on them? And so if people are really struggling, it's probably because they can't get feed to their livestock or those livestock are stuck somewhere. And so, how do we work around that? Where do we get feed resources? What are the priorities when we're dealing with these animals? Those are all things that you can work through with the emergency managers, with the state. You know the producers in your area, and so you understand what they may have, what they don't have. Do you have producers that have tractors that can help other producers out? Do you have feed resources somewhere that you can help deliver to another place? So those are all things that extension is going to play a pretty significant role in, is understanding where those resources are at and how to distribute those. If you need help finding feed resources, CCA and CDA both have hay resource sites on their own pages. That's the Colorado Cattlemen's Association and the Colorado Department of Ag. Um, Oftentimes when we have these big winter disasters, winter storms, maybe we can't get access to the feed that those places have, and so we need to bring some feed in. Certainly, we'll be working with the state in major situations where feed is going to need to be delivered by helicopter or something like that. And so really your role is obviously not to fly the helicopter, but your role is to let the state know, hey, these folks might need feed access. I haven't heard from these folks. You know the people in your community, and so that's really your role, is to make sure that everybody in your community has their needs met. One tip that I'll give for you all, if people are concerned about how much feed do I need to deliver to these people, this is just some rules of thumb for you if you're ever consulting with emergency managers or somebody delivering that feed. Um, most uh, Most mammalian species, 2% of body weight is going to be the maintenance level. And then just remember that when we're talking about cold weather, for every degree below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, it's a 1% increase in TDN. And so all that means is that it's going to require more than just that 2% to maintain that animal's body heat. So those are just tips that you can have for people if they're wondering, well, how much hay do we need to get? How much hay do we need to deliver? Those are strategies that you can use to kind of help do quick math problem to get enough feed to those livestock, at least to get them through until they can get feed out to them through their normal means. A second example here is on the opposite end of the spectrum where we talk about high heat. And fortunately in Colorado, we don't have a lot of humidity, but from this relative humidity index here, you can see that even at, you know, 80 mid 80s here, if we have 30% humidity, which sometimes we will get to in Colorado, we do start to have some emergency situations. And so this table here is one that I use to assess when we have hot days. Do we have urgent situations where we may need to address the heat of cattle in particular in feedlot situations? And so as these cattle get heavier and fatter, certainly when we start to get up into these orange areas here and definitely into the red areas, we can start to see animals die. And so in a situation where we have a really hot day, maybe a humid day, and these animals are really large, at the end of their feeding period, and we may see a die off. And so, what do we do in that situation where we get, it might not be a call from the feedlot, but maybe a call from a concerned citizen that there's a bunch of dead cattle out in the local feedlot? And so, what's our role there? So I wanted to put this up here for you all so you had another technique to kind of assess whether or not this was an emergency. Um, Really, all you need to know here is that when cattle start to pant, that's an emergent situation. This is the base, this is the equation that they use to determine this. But really, when these cattle start to breathe over 90 breaths per minute, then we have an emergency situation. So when we combine this heavy breathing rate with the temperature humidity index, then we know we may have a situation that we need to address. And so how are we going to address that? So what cattle are at risk when we have a situation where we know that we have cattle death? or any livestock death due to heat, how do we prioritize that? When we look at cattle, we're going to look at the biggest cattle first, the ones that are going to have the hardest time breathing, the ones that maybe don't have access to shade, things like that. And then how do we get those cattle relief? Remember that in any situation like this, one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to excite these animals. So if we have the opportunity to move these animals to a shady area, we need to be really careful and cautious about doing that. Um, do we need to adjust their feed so they don't have such a hot ration that's increasing their body temperature? And then if we have a situation where we have a lot of death in any sort of environment, how are we going to manage those? What resources do we need to get access to get rid of those carcasses, and how are we going to manage that from an optics point of view? So if a local community member comes to you and reports to you that there's been a lot of death, in this feedlot, that already doesn't look very good. And so what is your role, and how are you going to make sure that things don't get that things aren't taken in a way that look poorly upon animal welfare when it's just a really bad situation? So all things to consider when you're dealing with this sort of issue. Certainly in this specific case where we have cattle dying of heat stroke, heat stress, contacting the local fire department to get some water on those cattle is really important. Getting those cattle cooled down, making sure they have enough water, reducing their feed, trying to get some sort of shade relief for them if possible. And then sometimes we're just not going to be able to do anything. And so then managing that situation might be a role that you take, at least with community members that are asking you questions. And so, how are you going to address that when people come in and say, these people are abusing their animals and they're dying? You say, well, that might not actually be the case, and this is why. So things to consider if we have some sort of situation like this, which I expect that we will see as we get hotter and hotter. These are some good resource websites for you for heat stress. These are both veterinary resources for animal health, for cattle health in particular, if you have any questions about other disease roles as well. Any questions on diseases during disasters?
We did have one question, Dr. Kathy, in the earlier section about the screwworm. We had a question about just wondering about the person that contracted it, that got it on themselves, that was from the East Coast while vacationing. If there was what happened with that, if you could take a little bit of time to explain that, or if you want to answer that later on.
No, that's fine. We can go ahead and address that now. So that person obviously went to the doctor, got diagnosed with it. The human doctor recognized that the maggot that was pulled from the human was not one that they had seen before, and it was actually it was kind of interesting. It didn't go exactly like it was supposed to. So the doctor that originally saw it actually consulted with another doctor, and they reported it in another state. And so it was actually kind of a discombobulated sort of situation that fortunately didn't result in anything negative, but it just took longer than anticipated to diagnose that as screwworm. And so it sort of emphasizes the need that if you see something strange within your state, report that to the state veterinarian as soon as possible, instead of going to your neighbor and saying, "Hey, what do you think of this?" And then making the chain of command lengthen out. So that person was treated. It's a treatable disease. There's new drug, or I shouldn't say new, but there's now approved drugs for treating livestock if we do see these. And so that's the other important thing with screwworm. It's not a disease where we're going to be euthanizing these animals unless they're suffering, but we can treat these animals and get the disease under control. It's just the perpetuation of the disease that causes a lot of issues, and is the reason that we want to stop it, because it can kill animals. So hopefully that answered your question. But yeah, the person is fine, but that's a big risk for us. Is that this doesn't come over on just cattle or buffalo. Those are the animals that aren't allowed to come in from Mexico, but it comes over on any mammals, including dogs and cats and deer and feral swine and people. So So really important that every aspect of medicine kind of monitors that. Any other questions before we move on?
Um, doesn't look like there's any more in the chat. But thank you for taking the time to answer that.
As we go into the recovery phase and we monitor animal disease, I've already kind of touched on this previously, but there are issues that we're going to see that come up later on. So once people get their animals home, if they've evacuated, or once everything is sort of settled down, they may start to see these issues pop up. And I have a good example of this. Last year, I had a client that was in the Stone Canyon fire, and they moved all of their cows. I don't know, maybe like a week after they had AI'd them, because they were at risk of obviously going through the fire, and so they had a lot of abortion, early term abortion. They didn't see large fetuses, but a big issue that they had when dealing with this stressful situation. And so this is one thing that you can really advise your stakeholders on, is that they may have gotten through the disaster initially, pretty well. Their livestock lived. Nobody seems to be sick when they get them home. But this issue can continue on for some time afterwards. And so just understanding that there are still issues that they might see, and remind them that you need to continue to monitor. Don't be surprised if you have other health issues that come up, and how are we going to mitigate those health issues when we do see them. You may see some trauma as these animals are coming and going. And then also, I have a photo here. Beth, do you know what this disease is? That's a goat nose, and I'm aspirating an abscess on that goat's shoulder. Does anybody have any idea what that disease might be? It's a contagious disease in goats that we might see post evacuation if we've mixed all the goats together.
I don't know what it is off the top of my head.
So this is a goat that has CL, or caseous lymphadenitis. And so that's a fairly contagious disease. And if we're not careful about how we isolate goats, if we're doing goats would be a prime example of an animal that we might do an evacuation with and go to some fairgrounds. And if we're combining goats of different populations, this is a disease that we have a risk of spreading. And this disease you might not see for some time. And so another reason to be very careful about our biosecurity when we go to evac facilities. So our role as extension specialists in these situations, you're going to be the first point of contact for a lot of these producers to call and say, hey, I'm having this problem. My cattle are aborting. I'm starting to have some respiratory disease. I have goats that have abscesses now, and I'm not sure what happened. And you might be able to relate that back to some sort of issue during a disaster, whether that be some sort of exposure to other livestock, or contaminated water. It might be just the stress that occurred. It might be smoke, things like that. So all of those issues might be things that these producers might face post disaster, that you need to try and prepare them for as we're getting them back into their homes and getting things settled down. And so again, outreach and education, that's always our role in these issues. And so understanding what resources you have available for these producers post disaster. So for example, in a fire situation, there's smoke exposure resources available, what they can expect. If we have a lot of stress, and for example, in the example I just used, if I know that my producer just bred all of their cattle, a week or two before they had to evacuate, I can tell them, expect that your pregnancy rate might be lower, or you'll have to rebreed some of these cattle. Some of these females are going to come back into heat, because you can expect some pregnancy loss. And so those are things just to think about long term for your producers, just so they have some expectation of what can go wrong. Again, when we have evacuation situations, biosecurity when they go back home is also important. If they happen to have other animals that are there, let's say they evacuated their goats, but they left their cattle there, or they evacuated, one species, or they evacuated some of their animals, but not others. Quarantine again when they get back is really important. And so that's something that you can advise them to do, making sure they keep their animals separated for at least a couple weeks, if not a full month, before putting those animals back together. And then continuing to monitor those animals for disease as they continue to recover over the next couple months post-disaster. So here's an example, and this is an example of one that I dealt with this past summer, where we had smoke exposure in cattle. Obviously during a fire, if cattle are in the middle of the fire or close to the fire, they're going to get some smoke inhalation, and this goes not only for cattle but a lot of other species too. I see this a lot in dogs and cats as well, that are around fires. Yeah, around urban fire situations where they come in a couple weeks after the fire and suddenly they have some respiratory illness. And so we can anticipate that if cattle are close to a fire situation, or they've sheltered in place but are close to the smoke, we can anticipate that they may have some issues that come up. And so that'll be our role, as we deal with these clients when we're sending them home. As another case example, and Beth had brought this up to me, this was a good example. I think Eden has this resource for neurologic diseases in horses post-flood. And so there are diseases that can pop up when we have contaminated water in certain environments, that can cause issues with parasite migration in these horses, that can cause neurologic disease, other bacteria. Uh, Nothing necessarily specific, but certainly something like Potomac horse fever can look like this. Again, EHV1 can look like this. West Nile virus, any one of those diseases can look like this. So when we have these these sorts of scenarios where we have a significant flood, telling clients, telling stakeholders that they need to monitor their horses for a couple months afterwards for any signs of neurologic disease is really important. And so in this situation, our role is to really think about what could potentially go wrong post-disaster, right? Everything may look good, and later on we may have an issue. And so really making sure that your clients understand what they need to be looking for depending on the disaster that they faced is really important, and providing those resources to them as they need them. When we use something like equine neurologic disease specifically, remember that anytime we have an equine neurologic case, it needs to be reported to the state veterinarian, and there's forms that you fill out to get that accomplished. Just understand that in any one of these situations, advising your clients to consult their veterinarian for potentially treatments beforehand. If we have the risk of, let's say, in the smoke inhalation situation, if we're starting to see a break in respiratory cases, that might be a situation where you make sure that the veterinarian comes in and is consulted, so that maybe they can do a mass treatment of these cattle before we have a much bigger problem. Any questions on post-disaster disease?
There's nothing in the chat, but if anyone has a quick one, you could unmute. Okay, I think you can keep going, Dr. Patty.
All right. So, of course, we're going to talk about mitigation strategies. I have a superstar up here talking about education and training to constituents about biosecurity and about disaster management. Certainly preparing for these situations is going to be our best bet. Making sure that people understand how they're going to get out of a situation, what biosecurity strategies we're going to use. And these are all very broad topics, and sometimes can be hard to plan for because we haven't been faced with any sort of disaster. And so just keep that in mind, that people don't think about this on a day-to-day basis because it doesn't happen often enough to be as concerned. So really having those resources at your fingertips when things do go wrong is going to be really critical for your stakeholders. And we talked a lot about these trainings. The Department of Ag mentioned a lot of trainings. Beth has mentioned some trainings coming up that I encourage Extension to take advantage of, so that you are better prepared when these issues come up. Of course, understanding what resources that you have available are really important, including me as a resource, Beth as a resource, your emergency management work team as a resource. All of those things will help you be better prepared and help your stakeholders be better prepared when they're faced with an animal health issue during a disaster. And so we can't be prepared for everything, and not everything is going to go perfectly, but at least if we have a starting point, I think that's a good plan for you to have going forward. Remember that in a lot of the disasters that we see, other people in the state have gone through those before, and so reaching out to your constituents, reaching out to your fellow extension in our state and in other states is really important. So I don't think it ever hurts to get a second opinion or to get some advice on what somebody else has done in the past, what they thought was successful, what was a failure, so that you don't repeat those. I think is always a good idea. Although it is hard to think about that when you're in the middle of a disaster, but certainly keeping your wits about you and remembering your contacts and your resources is really important. So I've listed some more resources here for you. All these websites, in addition to the ones that I mentioned before. The Healthy Birds Info is the new website that has small flock resources that you can hand out to producers in your area. All these sites here deal with different emergency management response situations, strategies that people use, resource pages for your clients, all of those issues that you may face in the near future, or hopefully never, but certainly if an issue comes up, there are resources out there for you to access. With that, does anybody have any questions? Let me put my Beth, will you put my email in the chat? I'm not sure if I can.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And you guys are welcome to unmute and just ask your questions directly since we are at the end of it. So if you have other direct questions you would like to bring up for Dr. Kathy, feel free to unmute. And while we're seeing if anyone has any questions, I would just like to point out that Dr. Kathy and the state vet team as a whole is a great resource. I can speak from experience when I've had situations where I've called Dr. Whitman many times or said, hey, I need your advice on this, from a multitude of species. I've had people with parrot questions call me, and I've sent them also to Dr. Kathy. So just know that it's a huge resource to us, not just for disaster times, but in all other times, especially if it's more in the realm of a true DVM and not something that extension specialists could answer. So just know she's a great, great resource. I encourage you to reach out to her during disasters and definitely before, and to build that relationship with her, because you never know when you might need to call her, maybe a little outside of normal working hours, and it helps if she knows who's calling ahead of time so she picks up the phone, because I know we all hate getting spam calls at like 11 at night. No one likes that. So
And usually I'm pretty good about if I don't know the answer to the question, I'll try to find somebody that does. So I think that's another role that we have in extension, is that we can't know everything, and so reaching out to those people that do is really important. And I think that a lot of us are getting, at least myself, I'm getting much better at that. So I usually can find just some sort of answer, maybe not a solution, but at least something. Will get you some information. So encourage everybody to be somewhat prepared, for animal health issues. You guys will be on the front lines of this. Anytime we have any sort of emergency or otherwise. I mean, when we had the herpes virus outbreak, that wasn't a foreign animal disease, but it certainly was a big concern for a lot of horse people. And so a lot of us were fielding those calls and seeing information on Facebook that was a little bit sketchy. And so I think being a reasonable resource for your stakeholders in any sort of animal health situation is important, because you are looked at as an expert in agriculture. And so even if you don't feel comfortable with that, that's what I'm here for, and I can help you feel comfortable, and we can work through that. So
Well, we just appreciate everybody's time. Again, Dr. Whitman's contact information is there in the chat. Dan Frazian is on from the CDA, and then of course, myself, Beth Hayes, I'm the Extension Emergency Management Coordinator for Colorado State University. So if you have questions, if you're a community member, if you're an outside state agency and you want to connect with the three of us at any point in regards to either CSU or CDA, please feel free to do so. I'll make sure that everyone's relevant contact info is in the posting with this recording so that you can easily just email any of us that you have questions for, and we can kind of help direct you from there. So unless there's any other last questions, I think we're good to go. Thank you so much, Dr. Whitman, for taking the time to talk to us and do this wonderful presentation. And we really appreciate you and everything you do.
All right, thanks you guys, appreciate it.
Thanks. All right, everyone have a great day and enjoy the cold weather. Have a great day all.